The Flintshire Observer on the 11th of February, 1892, reported the following. Quote, "It is reported that the captain of the Eider is strongly in favor of the view that the ship will yet be saved. It is understood to be this impression which induces him to stay at his post until the ship has been lightened of her cargo. The Queen's message to the lifeboatmen has been posted on the front of the lifeboat houses, and the crew and their friends are very proud of it."
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story, The Strength of the Ider?
Here we are. Enjoy!
The Eider was a 5,129-ton iron-hull steamship built in Glasgow in 1883 by John Ider and Company, which gave the ship her name. She was described as a first-class ocean passenger vessel and one of the best vessels of the North German Lloyd Lines fleet. It was a part of this fleet that the Eider began her route, which would take her between New York and Bremen, specializing mostly in the large amount of immigration that was taking place at the time. She had accommodations for 170 first-class passengers, 150 second-class passengers, and 1,000 people in steerage. She was known as an exceedingly fast ship for the time, having made records for both her eastward and westward voyages. It was possible for her to travel between her destinations in less than 8 days in favorable conditions. She was also known for her uneventful voyages. The worst voyage she had ever made was on her 86th voyage homeward, when her engines broke down on the 4th day. Her captain turned down all offers of assistance, and the ship managed to limp into Southampton under her own steam, 4 days behind schedule. At 11 in the morning, on the 23rd of January, 1892, the Eider departed from New York, headed to Bremen. It was to be her 87th voyage home. On board, she was reported to have 20 first-class passengers, 21 second-class passengers, and 119 steerage passengers, but later reports would state that the number of passengers was 227 in total. The number of crew members was much more firmly placed at 163, under the command of Captain Heinecke. This was the first voyage with Captain Heinecke in command of the Eider. Indeed, it was his first voyage on the Atlantic route, but he had command of other vessels of the North German Lloyd Line, including the Stuttgart, so he was not without experience. As the Eider approached the channel on the 31st of January, a thick fog descended. They were able to see the Lizard lighthouse fine, but they missed the entrance to the Needles in the fog, not being able to see the light that would have guided them, and not having a pilot on board. At this point, it was 10 at night and therefore dark, and with the thick fog, they were only able to see about half of a ship length ahead. It was a dangerous stretch to be in with no idea where they were. It was a current that guided the ship, without anyone being able to see it, straight onto Atherfield Ledge, near the southernmost point of the Isle of Wight. It was a notorious shipping hazard, one that most captains gave wide berth to, but Captain Heinecke and his crew had no way of knowing the danger they were in. They were taking soundings, and it was reported until right before disaster struck that the water was deep enough that the crew felt safe. That was until a wave had lifted the ship and brought her down broadside on the rocks of the reef. Both her bow and stern were still in deep water, but with her midsection firmly on the rocks. There was little chance that the Eider was going to be able to complete her voyage any time soon. When the Eider struck, a terrible shudder shook the entire ship, and it was accompanied by a rasping, grating sound. The passengers, most of whom had retired for the night, rushed the deck in panic, many of them still in their night clothes or partially dressed, afraid that they were in immediate danger. Soon, the deck was full of men and women's frantic voices, and the sound of children crying. It was with great difficulty that the officers were able to convince the passengers that there was no immediate danger, and that they should return to their cabins and get properly prepared to abandon ship if the need arose. At the same time, the crew was instructed to ready the lifeboats just in case, so that if things on the ship did become dangerous, they could evacuate as quickly as possible. Through the fog, they could catch glimpses of the shore, and they found that it would be a voyage of about a mile to travel between the ship and the land. Initially, the Eider tried to use her fog whistle to attract assistance, but since it was an area with heavy traffic and it was indeed foggy, the Atherfield Coast Guardsmen initially took no notice of the whistle. It was not until the Eider also began to fire distress rockets, and the notes of the whistle became longer and clearer distress signals, that the Coast Guard realized that their assistance would be needed, and they prepared to depart. They also notified all nearby stations to send reinforcements to the area just in case. When the Eider had struck, the weather had been relatively calm, and the only impact on conditions had been mist and fog. But as the lifeboat departed from Atherfield, the weather began to take a turn for the worse. The lifeboat had to fight against the winds and waves to reach the Eider, guided by her frequent firing of distress rockets, and they did not come alongside until midnight. The storm not only added to the danger that the men in the lifeboat were in, it also drove the Eider further onto the rocks. With every wave that smashed over her, it ground her higher onto the rocks and ripped holes into her hull, making it less and less likely for the ship to be able to free herself eventually. As the Atherfield boat came alongside, they called up to Captain Heineke, asking if they could take any of the passengers off. Captain Heineke refused, stating that he felt confident in keeping his passengers safe. Eventually, his passengers began to feel less confident in the continued safety of the ship, no matter what the captain said, especially as the ship continued to be battered with waves. Some of the passengers earnestly begged to be allowed to go with the lifeboat to shore, and it was eventually agreed that they could. 13 of the passengers were taken off by the lifeboat, and though they reached the shore safely, their voyage was so unpleasant that it was not swiftly repeated. The next day, Captain Heineke remained stubbornly hopeful that they would be able to free the Eider from the rocks. He ordered the crew begin to throw the cotton bales that made up part of her cargo overboard to lighten her while they waited for 2 tugs, one from the company and one from the government, to come and try to tow them off the rocks. With the tide high and the cotton bales overboard, it was decided to see if they could free themselves under their own power. At 2 in the afternoon, the engines were started, but to no avail. The waves had driven her onto the rocks with enough force that she would not be freed without assistance. A few lifeboats still made their way alongside the Eider and offered assistance, but Captain Heineke was determined that once the tugs arrived, his ship would be freed, and they would be able to continue their voyage. So he turned them down. Eventually, however, Captain Heineke was forced to see that there was real danger for the passengers if they remained on the ship. The storm showed no sign of abatement, and the waves continued to batter the ship, forcing the ship to begin to list heavily to port as the tide had been holding her went out. Captain Heineke ordered that the ship's minute guns be fired to summon the Coast Guard to return. The Coast Guard, hoping to avoid more dangerous voyages in boats, attempted to reach the Eider with a rocket line, ball, and chain and line, only to have all of them fall short due to the strong winds blowing against them. In the end, they were forced to evacuate the ship with lifeboats battling the waves. From all of the neighboring stations, lifeboats were dispatched, and began to try to fight their way alongside the ship. Due to the ship's position on the rocks, the lifesavers were in danger of being smashed against the reefs by the waves, but the evacuation took place without serious accident. By 10 at night, on the 1st of February, all of the passengers were safely on shore. All but 15 of the hundreds of mailbags that the Eider had carried were also taken off by the Coast Guard. As the Northern German Lloyd Line officials scrambled to find accommodations and transportation for the now stranded passengers, the worst part of the ordeal was over. The crew remained on board the Eider, however. The weather was beginning to calm, and Captain Heinecke remained confident that he would be able to save his vessel. Even when the tugs did arrive, they were not immediately able to come to the Eider's aid. The ebb tide meant that trying to tow the ship off would be useless, and they stood by and instead began to salvage the cargo the Eider was throwing overboard, in the hopes that at least some of it could be saved. As evening went on, 4 more tugs would join the first 2, and the crew on the Eider was told that the attempt to tow them off would come at 1 in the morning. The attempt was made, but the tugs were not able to pull off the Eider. That evening, around 6 at night, the Eider had slid astern suddenly, and the men who had been working in the engine room still had been forced to run for their lives as water suddenly washed in. At first, the order was given to man the pumps to try to keep the rushing waters at bay, but eventually this was seen as a fruitless exercise and abandoned. The ship did not seem in any more danger of slipping, and so the crew spent a cold and dark night exposed to more stormy weather, unwilling to signal the lifeboat's crews that had endured so much in the past few days at their expense. It was not until the next morning that the signal for help was finally sent up, and the lifeboats were dispatched once again. The crew was pulled off and sent on to Bremen by way of another North German Lloyd Company ship, with the exception of Captain Heinecke and 25 members of the crew who remained to guard the cargo. The most valuable cargo, 8.5 tons of silver, was taken off of the ship by the local lifeboat crews who were hired for that purpose by Captain Heinecke, who acknowledged that it was not part of their regular duties, and brought to shore where it was certain to be safe. With the silver, the remaining members of the crew also came ashore. The reporters were shocked to see how scantily clad the men were for the weather, which had turned bitterly cold. But none of them had time to grab overcoats and other cold weather gear when the water suddenly filled the ship. With the departure of the crew of the Eider, the ship was now in the hands of salvage workers. There was a firm general belief the ship was past all help, but 2 salvage companies, one British and another from Hamburg, were willing to take the job on a no-cure, no-pay basis, which showed that they were confident they could manage it. The storm that had helped in the stranding of the Eider proved not to be the tone of the month. Most of February proved favorable for salvage work, and divers were able to hoist the 500 tons of tobacco and cotton out of the Eider using slings. Once the cargo had been removed, the attempt was made to lift her stern. On the 7th of March, this was done only to find that the leaks in her hull were too much for the pumps on the salvage ships. It was not until the orlop deck was made watertight and the Eider's own donkey pump was put to work that they started to win the battle against the water. They had thought they would be able to completely lift her at this point, but another gale blew in and postponed the operations, while everyone waited with bated breath to see if the storm had destroyed all of their hard work. The Eider lived up to her reputation for having been a solid ship. She suffered almost no further damage in the storm, and on the 27th of March, the ship that everyone had thought was past saving was lifted from the rocks, and under the escort of 4 salvage vessels, the Eider finally arrived at Southampton. Much more delayed than the 4-day delay that had been her previous worst record. The arrival of the Eider at the Empress Yard in Southampton was considered nothing short of a miracle. The German emperor, in his excitement, sent a congratulatory telegram that was met with some ridicule, since in it he claimed that the sturdiness of the Eider was proof of good German shipbuilding, apparently unaware that the ship had been built in Scotland. The Eider was not fated to sail again, however. Though her back had not been broken on the rocks, as many had thought, the damage to her hull still proved to be too much for the North German Lloyd Line to consider it worthwhile to repair. They initially put her up for auction, but when the minimum bid of £10,000 was not met, the ship was consigned to the scrapyard. Though the Eider's bones would not join those of many other ships on the Atherfield rocks, the rocks had claimed her all the same. For more information, please see Shipbuilding and Marine Engineering International from May 1, 1892, or see our other sources in the description below. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.